Hi, everybody. Welcome to our weekly little video segment. We're calling it Break It Down as we look at the foster care basics, helping foster parents and the community understand some of the really basic concepts that might be confusing, like what role does everybody play? And eventually, we're going to talk about the court hearing process because that can be when you're not in the world of foster care, when you're not doing it every day, or when you're new, it can be really overwhelming. So, we are really lucky to have Kendal with us today. Kendal is a foster parent and formerly a DSS caseworker for many years. So, she's going to talk to us about the role of the caseworker and how foster parents can be really good partners. So, thank you so much for being with us today, Kendal.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Do you mind just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about kind of your history in being involved in the world of foster care?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kendal Farmer. I actually started DSS as a foster care worker almost 13 years ago. I was a foster care worker for several years and then switched into foster home licensing and did that for many years and then moved into supervising various aspects of licensing, initial licensing, kinship licensing, that sort of thing. I left last year, so I have been out of DSS since June of last year. I am a foster parent. I have been for about 10 years. I started fostering not long after I went to work for DSS when I saw that need, and am involved with the local FPA. So I have some experience with foster care there.
So definitely a wealth of knowledge, and we're so glad to have you. So can you tell us, you talk to us like about the roles that you've played, but can you tell us how you originally got connected to this work? Why you continue? Because we know that, being a foster parent, being a caseworker, both of those roles sometimes feel a little bit thankless. They feel overwhelming. So tell us a little bit about how you got started and how you continue.
Sure. And I've thought about this because I frankly am not sure I remember anymore, but I really just always wanted to be a social worker, wanted to help people. I did some kind of research and studying on Department of Social Services when I was in college. I really wasn't super familiar with the world of foster care. Adoption was kind of blind to that, but knew I wanted to work in that. Not really sure why. But I, right out of college, that was my first job. So I went to work with DSS as a caseworker, and quickly it just became a calling for me. So I, just feel like that was kind of why I was put here. That was my purpose. That was how I could try to improve the world a little bit. And so just have always continued in that work in some capacity.
That's really, I think, probably a lot of people's stories. There is something that captured them, and then once they knew the need, once they saw the work that needed to be done, couldn't turn themselves away.
Mhm.
So, what surprised you in those early days of being a caseworker? Tell us a little bit about what that was like, what it was like to be a new caseworker.
So I'm going to be very honest here. I had a lot of what I call, I guess, culture shock. I'm fortunate. I grew up with loving, kind parents. I attended sort of a small private school. So I was almost oblivious, I guess, to sometimes what was occurring around me. And so those first few years were tough at times, to see the abuse and neglect, to see what generations of addiction and mental health crisis will do to families. I remember calling my parents on numerous occasions from the DSS van in tears, just not sure that I could continue, because it's tough to see the secondary trauma that can be real for many people, to constantly sort of have that exposure to pretty horrific situations at times was challenging. Um, and then just the overwhelming sadness, I think, that can come along when you really, like you said, it's people's calling. It's they want to help people get into the work because they really want to make a difference. And so to balance that with systemic barriers and family issues, and just realizing that there is sometimes a lot of sadness in that, even in the good, like in an adoption story, for instance, there's sadness in that there's a parent that lost their child in that, and learning to balance all of those emotions.
So, w- tell us a little bit more about the role. What are the duties, the responsibilities of a foster care caseworker? Because as a foster parent, you may have one or two kids or cases in your home, but the caseworker has many. So can you tell us a little bit about the duties and then kind of that caseload as well?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it does get confusing. I said early on, right after I started fostering, that I didn't know how people did it that didn't have a background knowledge. I had worked for DSS for 2 years. I kind of knew the lingo. I knew what they were saying. I knew what, all the court stuff meant. But I could see how it would quickly be pretty overwhelming for me as a foster parent if I didn't have that baseline knowledge. Because, like you said, there's a lot of players. There's, guardians, you have a worker, a licensing worker, but your foster care worker is the worker for your child and that child's family. um, Duty wise, I try to make a list. It's long. There's lots of things, particularly these days. Of course, I can only speak from my experience and from my time there, but everything from monthly visits with the parents to monthly visits with the foster parents, doing their face to face. Of course, everything accompanies, dictation and documenting that in the system. They're responsible for foster care review board packets and attending those monthly. Court hearings, depending on the county, could be several times. There's a lot of paperwork that goes into the court. The court prep before that, coming up with treatment plans with the families, attending the family team conferences that sometimes are an ongoing thing now, and that documentation, and then working that treatment plan with the family. So their responsibility is not just to, the foster child, but to the family as well. So helping them with visits, making referrals for counseling or parenting, figuring out the best services that family needs is all kind of that responsibility in addition to the child. So ensuring the child has an appropriate placement, getting them back and forth to those placements, sometimes every day for these children that are suffering through some long overnights or emergency placements. Just a physical duty of trying to transport them and get them to and from, and making sure, they're enrolled in school and mental health counseling, and they have had all their doctor's appointments and their dentist appointments, and then compiling the records and making sure that all of that is documented every single month.
So when we look at the scope of work that a foster care caseworker is doing, it is reasonable that, these people who are passionate about this, they are pouring into the child, and they have responsibilities to the parent, and they have responsibilities to the foster parent, and to the guardian, and to their county, and to court. So how do you balance all of that?
I think that's probably the biggest struggle, is what I always have found to be. It's what I'd venture to say for most workers now. It's a time, it's a work-life balance. Of course, if you have your own children and your own family, pouring countless hours in for your foster children can be a struggle. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is managing the time, trying to figure out how to do all. And like you said, it's not just one, one child. That list extends to many. Caseloads are still pretty large in a lot of counties, and with turnover, that, doesn't really change often. So it is constantly juggling and prioritizing, and what's the crisis of the day is kind of the mode that I think takes over a lot of times.
Yeah. So now, you had the experience as a caseworker and working for DSS. You were a foster parent at the same time. Now that you are just a foster parent, and everything that you've learned, what do you do now? Understanding really the role of the caseworker. How can you be a good partner foster parent with your caseworker or your child's caseworker?
So I think, and again, I can only speak for what I'm able to do. My husband and I are fortunate. We have pretty flexible jobs and have the ability. We do transport almost always, just because I know what a struggle that can be for workers. Car seats, what car seat? How to book them in the car seat? How do I do that if I've never had kids and I don't know? And then, if I've got kids in Greenville and Columbia, and then I've got to figure out how to get the parent there, and I've got to pick up multiple children, and then it runs into mealtime, and I figure out, do I have to feed them? How do I get them lunch? If it's a baby, I'm trying to learn how to fix a bottle. That would probably be overwhelming for me. And I've parented many children, so try to assist where I can. For us, we can do that transport. That's something we're able to do. I think the biggest thing is really having grace and patience and understanding. Are they always going to be as responsive as we would want them to be, or say the things that we feel like we need them to? Maybe not, but trying to understand, which I, have been there. So I always try to remember, what was it like? What would I have wanted, or would I have wanted people to extend me grace on those times that I, was on call. So I was up all night, or I had been, working 24 hours straight, or whatever it was, to just extend a little bit of grace. So I, I do type out, like every month, I'll type out a summary of our foster children's, medical visits, therapy visits, how they're doing, kind of capture those key things that I know the caseworkers have to document, their, medical and education and mental health, those type things. And I will type that out for them so that they can either, use that in their dictation, or now they have the ability to link some things. Every time I go to the doctor, therapist, or whatever they have, I, try to always remember to get an after visit summary so that I can send that to them to try to alleviate, the requesting records can be just a cumbersome process. So if I give them the records of every time we go, to try to help them with that. And then, like I said, I think really just having empathy for understanding where they are. Sometimes it's really hard, and saying, if I can't get you, and I have an emergency, what's a backup number, so that I have a plan, so that I know as a foster parent, my needs are met, but understanding that you have your own challenges, and how can we partner to work through that. I've done a lot of, I'll have even a $5 or $10 Starbucks gift card when they come for their home visit, and to hand them, and just to say thank you. I know it's hard, but we appreciate what you're doing. My husband took donuts to the office last week because it's social work month, to leave it for everybody, just as a way to say, hey, we see you, we know that it's hard work, and we appreciate you. So sometimes the little things, can mean a lot too.
Yeah, definitely. And, being a good partner, as a foster parent, partnering with your child's caseworker certainly doesn't mean that there's never going to be conflicts or challenges or questions or disagreements. So part of that partnership might be finding out how to advocate for yourself and advocate for the kids in your home when there are disagreements. Have you ever had that experience, or maybe have any advice for foster parents that are feeling like, hey, I'm trying to be a good partner, but I'm not getting what I need, or my kids aren't getting what I feel like they need?
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, and I think I've recently tried to, take a step back. So maybe stop and think for a minute, because there have been times where I feel like, wow, that would have taken a simple phone call to let me know that, or a text, or just common courtesy, or don't call the day of for a visit. But again, before I respond or get upset, or I try to stop and think, what could have been the circumstances around that. Maybe that was just absolutely necessary. Maybe it was just the honest oversight, and can I extend grace in this moment, and sort of move on. Or then there have been times where, you just have to decide, like you said, if your child is not getting what they need, if you have to figure out, I always try to go to the caseworker first. We talk about that a lot, I think, in this realm of follow the chain of command. So always extend them the courtesy of asking them. But obviously, if you need something beyond that, and you need to go to a supervisor or someone else, or ask somebody else, always try to, like you said, partner with that worker the best you can, and say, hey, I know, have had to say, look, I know you're busy, or, you're not getting an answer to this either. So let me help. Maybe I can go to someone else and try to get us an answer. Because sometimes sometimes it's out of their hands. When, we're just talking about that caseworker, sometimes they're struggling maybe to get a response or whatever. And so partnering may mean, hey, let me take up that advocacy and just know that I'm not, throwing you under the bus. I want to help all of us get to a better place or get our needs met, to partner together for that.
I mean, I think that what you're saying is so true, and it crosses, not just the foster parent to caseworker relationship, but like how many times can we all benefit, can the team benefit, and especially the child benefit when we just extend a little grace. Grace for the child, grace for the parents, grace for the, professional team, and grace for ourselves, because all of these roles are hard and there's so much uncertainty. And we're all, I think what I take away is, if we can just believe that everyone is doing the best that they can,
Mhm.
it is a little bit easier to extend that empathy, but also continue to advocate.
Right, right.
So, as we wrap up, Kendall, is there just maybe one last piece of advice or one thought that you have for foster parents, whether they're new or seasoned, in fostering, and how they can partner well with their case team?
I think grace and empathy, like we've said. I think sometimes understanding, sometimes having a conversation. A lot of workers will tell you quite honestly where they're at, what their capacity is, and sometimes we may not know. We may not understand what their week has been like, or what their current caseload is like, what their current struggles are. So saying, just a simple conversation, just like you and I are having, or like I would have with foster parent friends, or with my husband, just to say, hey, is there something we can do for you? And a lot of times that will open up the dialogue for them to say, this is where we're struggling, or I've been up at 5 o'clock every morning this week running kids to different placements. And so, and then you may have an understanding of why, there's why they couldn't get back to you or something. And then maybe there's something you can do. Maybe as simple as, recently I washed some clothes. If they've got kids sitting in the office all day waiting on placement, which we know is the reality. There's needs that they need, whether it be food or snacks or clean laundry, things like that for those kids, that DSS just isn't always equipped to be parents 24/7. That's, sort of our job. So helping and doing little things if we can, but really, I think just trying to have an open, honest conversation and hear what they're saying, and then have empathy for that and extend some grace.
Well, thanks so much, Kendall. And I think, we'll keep coming back to that, the grace and the empathy and trying to understand, because that, I think that really is core to so much of just our experience, in doing the work of foster care, which is bettering our communities and supporting our neighbors and, loving other people. And that needs to extend to our case team as
And
well.
it's
So
hard.
thank you.
Don't hear me. It's very
Yeah.
challenging, but I think there's no other way through this but to have that. Sometimes none of us, including caseworkers, can change the systems or certain struggles, but we can all choose to have a little bit of grace.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kendall. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I really, really am so glad that we get a chance to do this series where we just kind of talk about the basics, because once you're in it for a little while, it feels like, oh, yeah, common sense. I know what a caseworker does, but we forget that before we were in this world, we might not have known, or we might not have understood the capacity or the fullness of what everybody is doing. And I don't know that we will ever understand fully how the system works, because there are so many moving parts. But hopefully, in having these conversations and providing just a little tiny piece of information, will help those considering foster care feel like they can ease in and take steps to learning. Those of us who are just getting started can feel confident that we're not alone in not knowing everything. And those who have been fostering for years, they're still learning too. And so it's helpful to have little reminders of what's going on. So thank you, Kendall. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Bye.